So how did you start working at the lottery?
Okay, so I got out of high school and went to work part-time in the State House.
I was working in a warehouse, sort of a dead-end job, and my dad told me that I should go apply at the lottery.
Sheila Dubrowski and David O'Reilly were just teenagers when they both heard about jobs opening up at the Massachusetts State Lottery.
And they were looking for people to work the night shift.
It would be a night job.
Working the overnight shift, 6 at night to 7 in the morning.
So it wasn't really that desirable.
They just asked if I had a driver's license and how many hours I could work.
And I said, that sounds like an opportunity.
They hired me on the spot. They needed people right away.
We're picking up the story in 1976. It's been 5 years since the lottery bill passed into law, and 2 years since the first scratch ticket came out. But once again, sales of the lottery's existing games were in decline. The scratch ticket craze had worn off, and so the lottery was staffing up to launch a new game, a new kind of game, really, that required a level of infrastructure and people power unlike anything the state had attempted before. For one thing, it was a daily lottery drawing rather than weekly. But the real difference, the thing that made this game so much more complicated to pull off, was that for the first time, players got to pick their own numbers.
Picking your own number was a completely different form of gambling.
It was called simply the numbers game.
You know what number you want to play? I want number 5, number 7.
But for the game to work, all the betting slips with the players' numbers had to be received and recorded by the lottery before the drawing took place.
The customer kept a copy, the store kept a copy, and we had to bring a copy right back that night.
Betting closed at 5 p.m. The drawing was at 10:30 p.m. Just a few hours to collect thousands of slips from stores around the entire state. When O'Reilly and Dubrowski first started at the lottery, they were foot soldiers in this daily effort.
We had these gremlins, if you remember what a gremlin is. There was a very small car that we used. We used the state cars.
Picture it, 19-year-old kids in gremlins fanning out across the state, each with a route and a list of lottery retailers, names, towns, addresses, all organized on color-coded index cards.
Remember those great big books that had maps? That helped out a couple of times.
And it was a pretty good gig. The store owners would sometimes let the drivers grab a soda out of the fridge. They could even bring a friend along for the ride, as long as no one noticed.
Girlfriend, friend, sister. Yeah, anybody who would want to go, really.
But the stakes here were real.
I hadn't been trusted like that with a job, ever. You couldn't be late.
These tickets carried the weight of dreams. They had to get back to the lottery every day, rain or shine, traffic, accidents, no matter what.
It was icy, and I spun out, and the tree just came at me. So, yeah, I hit a tree. Yeah, totaled my car.
And did you still have to get the lottery tickets in?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They send somebody out to get the tickets.
In the early years of state lotteries, all they offered were so-called passive games. You buy a ticket, the ticket comes with a number, you wait to see if your number comes up. Even a scratch ticket, however interactive it might seem, is all predetermined from the moment it's printed. You don't choose your winning numbers. They're assigned to you. So why change it up? Why all this effort? Why send teenagers out driving around in snowstorms just so that lottery players can choose their own numbers? The reason is that a game just like this already existed. People already loved it. And it was run by gangsters.
The lottery was taking over for the old bookies.
From GBH News, this is Scratch and Win, the making of America's most successful lottery. I'm Ian Koss. Before the Massachusetts lottery could claim to be number one, they had to take out the competition. Because it just so happened that one of the most profitable illegal gambling enterprises in the entire country was operating right at their doorstep in Boston. The question now was, could the state beat the mob at their own game? This is part 3. Have you played your number?
Support for Scratch and Win comes from Safety Insurance.
From whoops to uh-oh to oh no. Safety Insurance can help you manage life's storms, even the indoor kind.
When I started spending time at lottery stores and talking to lottery players, I struggled a bit with how to start a conversation. Questions like, why do you play the lottery? Would produce short, routine answers. The question that always seemed to get people talking was, how do you pick your numbers? How do you pick your numbers every day?
I play my dog's birthday. I play my birthday.
Last 4 numbers of my mother's phone, shit like that.
You've been playing the same number for 10 years. What's the number?
I can't tell you.
It's hard to overestimate the power and allure of choice. In a world of long odds, factors far outside of all our control, there's a magic in picking your own number. A strange mingling of chance and choice, however unlikely it is that the number will actually come up.
At that number, I'll be here, my first day here.
I met this man from Brazil who every week plays the date that he first arrived in the United States and the date of his daughter's birth. Again and again, as if the gambles and dreams of his entire life are bound up in these simple 3 digits.
Maybe the God throw money to me.
It's really a kind of mystical act with all the rituals and traditions you might expect. Dreams, astrology, numerology.
So 3 + 2 is 5, + 5 is 10. That's a 1.
Sports, dates, license plates, it's all mixed up in there. Even the New York Yankees.
I keep the 99 in there because Judge, he's my man. So I got double 9s in one of my numbers. I'm done.
Hey, can I get your name real quick?
Nope.
Thank you.
Elvis. Just call me Elvis. That's my first name.
All right. You can call it the numbers game, call it the daily number, or simply the numbers. Whatever you call it, this game we're talking about has its roots in Harlem in the 1920s.
There's a king in town that hangs around with a pencil writing numbers down.
Many different lottery traditions converged in New York in the 1920s, from Italy, from Ireland, from the Caribbean. So even back then, the idea of betting on random numbers was not exactly new.
A lot of the earlier games, the numbers that people bet on were drawn out of barrels, or people were sold numbered tickets.
Stephen Robertson is the co-author of the book Playing the Numbers, Gambling in Harlem Between the Wars.
And, there were limits to the extent to which that allowed people to bet on the numbers they wanted. And there were all sorts of questions about whether those games could be fixed or not.
So these early numbers games had a limited reach until sometime in the 1920s, somebody in Harlem made the breakthrough.
And for our money, that somebody is probably Casper Holstein.
Casper Holstein worked as a red cap at Penn Station, which at that time was one of the better jobs that a black man could get in New York. Red caps would carry people's luggage, give directions, hail taxis. And so Holstein would have seen up close how the rich, powerful, and white financial class of the city lived.
The story is he was collecting financial pages. He was trying to find a way to get ahead. He was paying attention to numbers. The stock market was people making money off numbers. And at some point, he realized that he could use those numbers and bring them over to the kind of gambling that was going on.
And he would do this using the so-called clearinghouse numbers.
So the clearinghouse was reporting each day on the total transactions between banks in New York City, as well as a number for the Federal Reserve.
Every day, a clerk walked out of the clearinghouse building in Lower Manhattan and wrote these various figures on a blackboard. They were also published in the financial pages, just like how papers publish the NASDAQ and Dow averages today. What Holstein worked out in this possibly apocryphal story is that all he had to do was pick certain digits out of those clearinghouse numbers, combine them, and you get a truly random 3-digit number. It would be public, it would be daily, and most important, it would be impossible to fix. However it happened, the clearinghouse numbers was born.
I've got those clearinghouse blues.
The game had a very simple structure. You pick your 3 digits, write them on a slip of paper, and deliver it to one of the many numbers runners in the neighborhood, along with the money you're betting, maybe just a few pennies or a nickel. All these bets are pooled together, and at 10 a.m., the day's number is revealed. If your number hit, meaning it matched, the money you had bet would be multiplied, often 600-fold. In an instant, 10 cents could become $60. Real money in the 1920s. Playing the numbers became a fact of life in 1920s Harlem. It was everywhere. And this is what Robertson and his co-authors document.
One of the things that we did in that project was to look really closely at Harlem's 2 black newspapers, the New York Age and the New York Amsterdam News. And we were really surprised by what we found.
They found human interest stories about people who had hit the number and how much money they won. Stories about the lavish lifestyles of the so-called bankers who ran the games. Stories about how the profits from numbers were being used to finance a black baseball team and the career of boxer Joe Louis.
There's a whole numbers kind of supporting industry that you can track.
The newspapers also had ads for so-called dream books.
Books that would literally tell you that if you saw, a cow jumping over the moon in your dream, that this was the 3-digit number that you should play.
Dreaming of apples, play 416. Bugs, 305. A gravestone, 999.
And they sold thousands of copies of these dream books.
Then there were endless newspaper columns criticizing the numbers as immoral or ungodly. There was even a story about a priest who told his parishioners that if they were playing the numbers, he didn't want their dirty money in his collection plate.
So he passed the collection plate round. Instead of the hundreds of dollars that he usually collected, they collected something like $10 only because everyone in the congregation was playing numbers. And so the clergyman then recanted and he sent the plate round again and said, all right, okay, I'll take your money even if you played numbers. And suddenly there's hundreds of dollars there again.
Seeing as the numbers were, of course, illegal, there were also stories of arrests and court proceedings. The researchers could then map these arrests block by block, building by building.
And it really highlighted that numbers was literally everywhere in the neighbourhood. They're all talking about it, they're all placing the bets, and it's in every institution in the city.
Given how much has been written about New York, the Harlem Renaissance, the Roaring '20s, I think it's surprising and also telling that this simple, ubiquitous activity is rarely part of those narratives. But it should be. The numbers was called the most popular indoor sport in Harlem. It was one of the most important forms of black-owned business, a source of capital for the neighborhood.
But I think the other real magic of this as a game is that connecting it to financial institutions in the 1920s gave it a kind of connection with playing the stock market.
The stock market was all the rage in the 1920s, before it crashed, that is. But only about 2 or 3% of Americans actually owned stocks at that time. So most people, certainly most black people, were not involved. And the clearinghouse numbers, even though the game was illegal, even though it was purely a game of chance, offered a way into that world.
People talked about investing when they played the numbers, where the people who ran the games were known as bankers, and it was the bank that was paying out. And, and there's a lot of evidence that this is how people who played the game understood it.
It's a little hard today to think of betting money on a random number as a form of investment, but for black residents of Harlem, who maybe didn't have access to the banking system at all, betting a few cents on the number every day was not such an irrational act.
it makes perfect sense to put a little bit of the money you've got onto this number because it could transform your life in a way that almost nothing else in your life could. And, and it really, if it comes down to it, is the share market really that more rational than numbers gambling? I don't kind of think it is.
The numbers eventually spread to Black communities all over the Northeast, from Baltimore to Philadelphia to Boston, where it remained a cultural staple for decades. So when we started working on this series, my co-producer, Isabel Hibbard, and I knew that we would want to talk to people who had played the numbers here in Boston, especially in the Black community. But we had trouble finding people willing to talk about it. Even now, decades later, the numbers, after all, was illegal. In a final effort, Isabel went to visit a senior center in a neighborhood called Grove Hall, in the heart of Black Boston. For good measure, she brought along her grandmother, who is exactly the right age to be hanging out at the center. And there, the two stumbled on a lively game of Pokino. It's kind of like bingo, and the women here, they were all women, are playing for pennies, red solo cups filled with pennies.
Cleared the board.
Everyone antes up, and at the end, someone will be going to the bank with rolls of coins, or maybe just saving them for next week. Apparently, the women here had wanted to play for quarters, but the senior center wouldn't allow it. Somewhere between pennies and quarters, a casual game becomes gambling. It seems we were in the right place.
I think I came to Boston in 1969.
One of the people Isabel met that day was Joanne Chambers, and she was happy to talk about the numbers. It had changed her life. Could you tell me, where were you from originally? Where were you coming from when you moved to Boston?
I was born and raised in a place called Lovejoy, Illinois, better known as Brooklyn, Illinois.
Brooklyn is in southern Illinois, much closer to St. Louis than Chicago. And so moving to Boston in the 1960s was a big change.
Oh my God, it was like 3 grocery stores, a fish market, all down Washington Street, and bars, We'd go clubbing.
Chambers settled in the historically Black neighborhood of Roxbury, where there was a Black-owned newspaper and nearby a Black-owned jazz club. It was a gathering place of Black cultures unlike anything she had experienced before.
I can remember that train, the Orange Line. Somebody sitting next to me, speaking another language, and they were dark as me. I'd never seen a Haitian. I didn't know what a Jamaican was. I was mortified. I'm serious. I ran home one day, got on the phone, called my girlfriend back home. Girl, these people here, some people here, they just Black as we are, but they don't talk like us. I'm kind of ashamed that I did, but that's really all I knew in 1969 and 68 when I first came here.
So when you first came to Boston, had you ever heard of the numbers?
No, never heard of the numbers, no.
Even then, in the 60s, the numbers was mostly just a Northeast phenomenon. Chicago did have its own variant of the game called Policy, but Chambers had never played that either. When she arrived in Boston, Chambers and her husband moved in with some family who were already living here. That's where they first saw the paper slips and the numbers.
I can remember in the morning, the kitchen table would be crowded there, the in-laws. But one morning I get up and I looked to see what they were doing, and this man was there and they were writing,
The man's name was Sandy. He always wore a suit and hat, maybe a trench coat in the winter, and he would make house calls in the neighborhood.
To find out what he was there for was to pick up numbers. They would give him so much money on this number. So my husband found out and he got into it.
Joanne never played the numbers herself, but Mr. Chambers did.
He didn't have no dream books, I know that, but he may be consulting his dreams.
And one day, his number hit. Sandy came back to the house with $3,000 cash. At the time, was that more money than you had ever seen before?
In 2024, I don't see that today. It's not pretty for me. I mean, when you poor, you're poor. So, that kind of money back then went long ways. And I remember it was a store named Ferdinand's in Dudley Square at the time. And they sold the furniture. It was gorgeous. And we went there, and for $3,000, that was like $1 million. We got, I never would forget these end tables. They were long, big, strong, gorgeous, and a couch. All of that, and maybe a few other things for $3,000. That was our start. See, so when we get this apartment, we're going to be all set, and we was all set.
There are countless stories like this of lives transformed and histories altered by a single hit. One that stuck out to me was the story of Secretary of State Colin Powell. When Powell was young, his father saw a number in his dream and then saw the same number up on the hymn board at church. He pooled together the money to bet $25 and wound up with a brown paper bag filled with $10,000. Enough to move the family out of the Bronx and put a down payment on a house. By the 60s and 70s, when Joanne Chambers stumbled on the game in Boston, the numbers was not simply a local affair in black neighborhoods. It had spread to white working class communities too.
My aunt played it all the time.
At some point in doing interviews, I just started asking everyone I talked to if they remembered the numbers.
She'd always play 7-Eleven, and she did really well with it.
In Dorchester, it was the cobbler, and he was running numbers. I played 107. That was my address. That was my lucky number. I never hit it, though.
It was kind of amazing to me how universal these stories were.
I had a cousin who was a bookie, a numbers runner.
Even out in the suburbs, you could play numbers.
I remember going into a store and a guy handed me a piece of paper and a quarter and saying, take this down to the hairdresser. I guess I was actually running numbers at the time, unknowingly.
Just try to imagine hundreds of bookies across an entire metro area, each collecting small bets, maybe just a nickel or a quarter at a time, from thousands and thousands of regular players. And all that money, all those bets, would be combined into a single pot with a single winning number. It was an operation with layers of management, coordination, infrastructure. And who could run an illegal business of that complexity? There's really only one answer: the mob.
It was just something mysterious about him coming there to that house and bringing the money to you.
And who did he work for?
Who knows? I don't know.
When does the Mafia start getting involved in numbers?
So very much at the end of Prohibition.
According to historian Stephen Robertson, it's really the re-legalization of alcohol that draws in the big-time gangsters. Because right up to that point, bootlegging liquor had been their main business.
If you're a white gangster, you need a racket to replace it. A lot of the venues for illegal liquor in black neighborhoods were also sites for numbers gambling. So they saw the amount of money changing hands, but they bring an extra level of violence that means that once they want control of the numbers, it's something that's going to happen.
Prohibition ended in 1933. By the end of that decade, the Harlem numbers game was in the hands of white organized crime.
A lot of the people actually collecting the bets on the streets are still blacks, but they're making a lot less of the money, smaller commissions. The money is leaving Harlem and going into the pocket of white gangsters, not into the pocket of black numbers runners in the same kind of way.
By the 1970s, there were mob-run numbers games in cities around the country. But here in Boston, there was one mobster who elevated the game to the true peak of its potential.
Jerry Angulo has over $1.5 million out in the street in Shylock at 1%.
Angulo and his brothers operate two businesses out of this office on Prince Street in the north end of Boston. One is called...
The Angiulo brothers ran the biggest numbers racket Boston had ever known. By some accounts, it was the most profitable mafia-run gambling operation in the whole country. Besides that office on Prince Street, there were 3 mid-level offices and 10 local offices reaching out into suburbs like Watertown, Medford, and Revere, miles from downtown. The man who ran it all was Gennaro, the second oldest of the brothers. People called him Jerry.
Jerry Angiulo is a man described as a powerful gangster. That's ironic when you learn what he wanted to be. You're looking at his high school yearbook picture. Back then, his goal was to become a criminal attorney, but he never did.
Jerry Angiulo was a small man, maybe just 5'6". He wore lifts in his shoes for extra height and big, heavy-framed glasses like Junior on The Sopranos. And what were Gennaro Angiulo's special skills? What made him good at running the numbers?
To use the term, he understood figures.
Ted Harrington, who we heard back in episode 1, ran the city's organized crime strike force. He told me that Angiulo, even with all his power, was known as a numbers guy, not a tough guy. There were even rumors that he had never killed anyone, at least not with his own hands, that in Mafia speak, he never earned his bones.
He gained ascendancy, not because he was a brutal person, just was a brilliant businessman.
Gennaro Angiulo didn't just take control of an existing gambling operation. He consolidated what had once been a loose network of independent bankers and bookmakers into a single regional operation. And the numbers game was always his specialty.
Jerry really didn't like the sports betting business because of the risk involved.
Ernie Danisco was a federal prosecutor on Mafia cases, so he knew Angiulo's operation well and knew that Angiulo was very cautious.
With sports betting, on certain weekends, you can have a rough weekend. And Jerry was just adverse to that. He just didn't want to do it.
Sports betting also carried more legal risk for the house because people were betting large amounts of money at one time, often on credit.
The one thing about gambling is it always leads to loan sharking. It's inevitable, like night following day. I mean, the FBI used to have a saying that on Friday afternoons, they would wait for a loan shark victim to come walking through the door, and they would make a case against mobsters in New York because they ran out of time, they had nowhere to go, and they thought the best alternative would be to cooperate. That was the risk that Jerry and his brothers, for the most part, sought to avoid, and they were very smart at it.
And so the advantage of running a numbers racket was just that the individual amounts were small enough that people weren't getting in so deep that it came to that.
Exactly. With the numbers, you're not going to get way in over your head. And the numbers game is a complete winner. You cannot lose if you're the house. And you have to remember back then, there was no competition from the state lottery.
The Boston Mafia was unusually reliant on their gambling rackets, thanks to a quirk of history. Unlike some other big cities on the East Coast, Italian Americans were always outnumbered here by the Irish. They were not the dominant ethnic group like they were in New York or nearby Providence, Rhode Island. What that meant is that the Mafia couldn't break into some of the bigger institutions of the city, like labor unions or construction. What they did have was numbers.
That was their meat and potatoes. That's where they made their money.
Given how lucrative the numbers was and how vital it was to the whole underworld, it's kind of surprising the lotteries didn't get in on the action right away. I mean, they had the model right there for exactly the kind of game people wanted. And yet, in state after state, they didn't follow it. They offered weekly drawings, they offered scratch tickets, but no daily game where players got to choose their own numbers. There was, of course, the logistical challenge of pulling it off, but maybe even more frightening was just the fear of association, that this was the mob's game. New Jersey took the plunge first this time, in 1975. Then in 1976, Massachusetts followed. To get the game design right, the lottery held secret meetings with former bookmakers and studied 10,000 betting slips. The goal was to replicate the illegal game as closely as possible, from the number of digits down to the different combinations you could bet on, right down to the name of the game itself.
And they actually called it the numbers game.
They called it the numbers game.
Oh, wow.
I showed Stephen Robertson, the historian of the numbers, one of the original paper betting slips printed by the state lottery, which says right across the top, the numbers game.
I mean, on the one hand, it makes great marketing sense because,
Right.
you're using the name recognition. But by the same token, numbers was illegal, and
Right.
so the fact that they, in their imbalance decided that they wanted the name recognition and they were quite happy calling a state enterprise by a kind of criminal activity strikes me as astonishing.
Clearly, there was no running or hiding from what this game was. The Globe headline on the day of the launch read, "The state is your bookmaker." The reason I'm spending so much time on the caution and peril surrounding this moment is that I think it's really easy to take for granted that the state lotteries succeeded and thrived and continued even. In 1976, that was not in any way assured. If you think of legalized gambling overall as a kind of slippery slope, then America at this point was definitely still sitting on top of the slide, thinking about climbing back down.
I remember the director at one of my interviews, and he said, throughout history, that lotteries come and go.
Again, David O'Reilly, one of the early staff on the numbers game.
But it always ends because the integrity wears off and the trust runs out. And he goes, if everybody does their job right, this will last. But one big mistake, that this will end.
Just the year before, in 1975, the New York Lottery had temporarily ceased all operations and let go of all its employees after issues arose in its ticketing system. Later on, someone actually managed to rig the Pennsylvania numbers game by injecting the balls with liquid to make some heavier than others, resulting in the ominous winning number of 666.
6. And the second digit.
There were constant fears that the Mafia would find a way to infiltrate the lottery, corrupt it, as if everything gambling touches will eventually rot from the inside. Which meant that the legal numbers game, more than any other, had to be flawless, squeaky, squeaky clean. The new personnel, like O'Reilly and Dabrowski, were only hired on a temporary basis. Their jobs depended on whether the game survived.
Because if the integrity was compromised, then nobody would want to play.
Which brings us to that mad dash across the state. The teenagers and gremlins with their free sodas and friends in the front seat. That whole system was about maintaining the game's integrity. Here's how it worked. Players made their bets on a paper form that looked like the answer grid for an old standardized test, rows of numbered boxes that you marked with an X. Every afternoon at 5 p.m., as piles and piles of those forms arrived at lottery headquarters, they would get scanned through a microfilm camera.
You'd have to check it periodically to make sure that it was good film, because it was very fast. It was a 2, 2, 2, 2.
That was part of Sheila Dabrowski's job, scanning every single betting slip.
Once all tickets were accounted for, that was the okay to go ahead and draw a winning number.
Almost immediately, scammers tried to game the system by showing up with winning tickets that they had filled in after the number was drawn. But of course, those tickets wouldn't show up on the microfilm.
They would go back to the film and verify that this was the winning ticket.
And the system held up. The story was, there was no story. No fraud. No scandal.
This is Lottery Live, the daily number on a $1 bet, all four numbers.
In fact, the game was a hit.
The daily number was huge. People lived by when that number was going to go off.
The winning number in the Massachusetts Daily Numbers game, 0281.
The lottery was incredibly popular.
Christy George was a reporter for WGBH, and she remembers when those nightly drawings began, the newsroom would get the number right around the time their show aired.
Tonight on the 10 o'clock news, an official...
Well, I worked for a nightly news show on public television. We covered Boston. We also covered Beirut.
Right.
But out in the field, you'd be talking to people, and they'd say, "Oh, I watched that show," and you'd go, "Wow, what do you like about the show?" And they'd say, "It's the first place I can see the number."
Chilly, mid-50s, and on Friday...
Just like the old clearinghouse numbers, it was a ritual, an institution.
You don't remember the jingle?
I don't.
Have you played your number? Have you played your number? Have you played your number today? Yeah, that was big.
Have you played your number? Have you played your number? Have you played your number today?
So the worst fears of corruption and infiltration did not come true. But the numbers game was such a success that it created a different but equally dangerous kind of scandal. That the lottery was too successful.
And I just decided maybe it was time to do things differently. And I ran.
In the very next election cycle, 1978, State Treasurer Bob Crane faced a primary challenge. Crane, you'll remember, was the so-called czar of the lottery. He set the tone, and he wanted the lottery to grow, wanted it to prosper. His challenger, who we've also met before, wanted to rein it in, specifically the way they advertised new games. How aggressive was the lottery advertising in the late 70s?
Mighty aggressive because it was creating a brand.
The challenger was Boston City Councilor Larry DeCara.
They really had not been the lottery for that long, and the lottery came up with some catchy, you can't win unless you play, that kind of stuff.
Not to mention that classic jingle. Have you played your number? It is catchy stuff. And these ads were especially concerning with the numbers game, because compared with other kinds of lottery drawings, this game had always been most popular in low-income neighborhoods, and specifically black neighborhoods. That's who the game was targeting. And Larry DeCara thought the lottery was taking it too far.
Yes, I thought that lottery advertising gave the incorrect message, just like sports betting does today, looking for people who don't have a lot of money to spend it.
Some candidates will offer slogans. I will talk about the substantive issues.
So you decide to run for Treasury. What's your pitch?
My pitch was that he'd been there a long time.
DeCara ran as a reform candidate, someone who would modernize the Treasury and how it handled the state's money, but also, like I said before, reform the lottery and the way it was actively promoting gambling among the public.
I've done my homework. It's time to actively campaign. Thank you very much.
DeCara saw it as a principled stand. His critics saw it as prudish, a little stuck up even.
The Globe columnist did a brutal piece on me. I think he said John Calvin walks among us or something like that. I'm a lot of things. I'm not a Calvinist. So yeah, I took some heat, but when you're in politics, you expect to take heat.
What DeCara did not expect were the hijinks. First, there was the high school history teacher.
At Doherty High in Worcester.
This teacher was a well-known local figure, involved with Little League baseball, the kind of person you'd love to have come up and introduce you at a campaign stop. And he had offered DeCara his help.
Maybe a month later, we were having something out in Worcester, and I said, call him up.
But all of a sudden, this teacher didn't want to have anything to do with him.
Turns out that he'd gotten a job working part-time for the lottery. And that's the last I heard of him.
Not a coincidence in your mind?
Not a coincidence at all.
Then there were the other candidates, two of them, both with kind of suspicious names, who jumped into the race right after DeCara.
One of whose first name was Larry.
There was another Larry, Larry Black.
And the other, a city councilor from Everett, whose name is Paul Cacchiotti.
And another city councilor, also with an Italian last name.
And I don't think it was by accident.
But here's the kicker. On the ballot, the candidates were listed in alphabetical order. Crane, the incumbent, followed by Black, Cacciati, and finally DeCara.
So inevitably, just human nature, somebody would get the Larrys mixed up. Inevitably, human nature, somebody would get the Italian city councilors mixed up.
And inevitably, I imagine some people just don't even make it to the fourth name down the list.
Inevitably, people don't.
The theory here, which DeCara has maintained ever since, is that Treasurer Crane convinced those other candidates to run in a deliberate effort to split the vote.
And the rules of politics are very simple, Ian. You cannot play offense when you're playing defense.
I just love that they found somebody named Larry. I mean, that's just too good.
And he was my classmate at Boston Latin School.
Have you given any thought to possibly dropping out and putting
None
your
whatsoever.
support?
DeCara stuck it out until Election Day, hoping against hope that he could break through in that muddled field.
Were I to be struck by lightning here at Channel 2 this evening, 'tis the will of God. Other than that...
But the breakthrough never came.
It was called early, 9:30, 10 o'clock. You know, and I remember standing up and saying, I may be broke, but I'm not a broken man. I remember that line. And it was a tough day.
This is one of several moments when the lottery faced a political challenge that could have limited or at the very least disrupted its operation. Crane's ability to beat back those challenges was part of what made the lottery keep growing, even as other states faltered. By the way, there is no concrete evidence to back DeCara's theory about the spoiler candidates, but there is circumstantial evidence. Shortly after that election, the other city councilor with the Italian last name, he got a comfy job working with Crane. So it seems the patronage machine that the legislature had hoped for was working, and the lottery's advertising could keep on working as well.
Excuse me, Jimmy. I'd like to tell you how to play the numbers game from the Mass State Lottery.
Hey, hold it, you. Off the mound now.
And here we find the basic irony of the numbers game. In this state and elsewhere, it was sold as a way to take business away from organized crime. You can see it in the press quotes from Treasurer Bob Crane. He would always reference the illegal rackets, how there were all these people out there gambling anyway, so they might as well do it with us.
Time out! Hey, buddy, you got one of those numbers game betting slips on you?
Sure got one right here.
That was the argument, but that's not all that happened. The state's numbers game and the advertising around it were tapping into a whole bunch of new people who were open to gambling, if it was legal.
You know, like, oh, wow, now it's legal. That's the first thing you think of.
Joanne Chambers, remember, never played the illegal numbers herself. That whole world felt a little mysterious and suspect. But once you put it at the corner convenience store and on TV, that's something else.
Oh, it's just something gets into you and you go, I ain't got nothing anyway. Can't got nothing to lose but $1.
She remembers going to try the new game after it launched in April and playing her birthday, April 17th, 417. After that, Chambers became a regular. She kept her playing in check. The game didn't ruin her life or anything. But still, Chambers told me she doesn't think the state should be in this business at all. It's too powerful.
It's a mind thing. Something's about that number business. Because you know self-conscious is not going to win, but still it overpowers the thought of winning.
She described how once you've been playing the same number every day for a long time, you start to feel this pressure build, almost a paranoia, that if you don't play that day, well, that'll be the day your number comes up.
You know, and you scraping up, looking in your bag for 4 quarters.
So you rush out to the store in the middle of the night, just before betting closes.
You write those numbers, there's a feeling, ooh, good high at the moment.
The official daily number, 6225.
Then that feeling dies, you go back to the same old.
All 4 numbers in exact order, paid off $6,052.
Do you still play the lottery?
Yeah, I do. I don't care how much you play, how much you lose. You always think you're going to win, and that's going to be the day every time you play. And it's not. Trust me. Mm-hmm.
By the time of that 1978 primary race, the numbers game was bringing in more money than scratch tickets, the lottery's last big experiment. But here's the thing. Jerry Angiulo's numbers racket was also doing just fine. Even several years after the lottery's copycat started up, the Angiulos were bringing in tens of thousands of dollars a day, tens of millions of dollars a year. It appears that the state had increased the size of the gambling pie. They had not entirely taken the Mafia's slice of it. To do that, the state would need some help from another corner of government, the FBI. Would you ever see Gennaro Angiulo out in the streets of Boston?
I don't think I ever did, but when I was U.S. attorney, he came in to see me.
Really? Again, Ted Harrington with the Organized Crime Strike Force.
With all his intelligence, he was kind of a loud-mouthed type of guy. So he was, watching the grand jury room and talking like if he were a big shot. I'd like to see Harrington, give him a piece of my mind. He's out there bragging he wants to see me, so I called him in.
Angiulo had faced competition before. He had been investigated and raided before, but it seemed like no one could touch him. At the courthouse that day, Angiulo had a few men around him as he ran his mouth in the corridor. But when Harrington made the invitation, those guys stayed outside.
He came in alone, and he was very thin. He was a wiry sort of guy.
What was his message to you?
Well, he was talking big when he was out in the corridor, but most of the gangland figures at least pretended that they were gentlemen. That was part of their shtick.
Inside the office, Angiulo was subdued, measured. The two men talked cordially for 15 minutes. But you knew at that point that you were coming after him, and he knew you were coming after him.
Yeah.
What Angiulo probably didn't know was that Harrington had signed off on an elaborate FBI scheme to bug his center of operations on Prince Street. Everyone knew Angiulo was a big talker, that he liked to brag. So all they had to do was get him on tape.
Multiple acts of murder and acts indictable under various federal statutes, including illegal gambling businesses.
In Boston, the numbers was about to be put on trial.
This may be the first time that the corporate structure of organized crime has been so completely dissected for public view.
That's next time.
You made me love you. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it. You made me want you. And all the time you knew it. I guess you always knew it. You made me happy sometimes. You made me sad. But there were times, dear, you made me feel so bad.
The series is produced by Isabel Hibbard and myself, Ian Koss. It's edited by Lacey Roberts. The editorial supervisor is Jennifer McKim, with support from Ryan Alderman. May Lay is the project manager, and the executive producer is Devin Maverick Robbins. One of my first introductions to numbers gambling was actually through a documentary film I collaborated on about a boxing gym in East Boston called Never Be a Punching Bag for Nobody by Naomi Yang. The film is a great window into the world of bookies and wise guys. I highly recommend it. I also want to thank the subject of that film, Sal Bartolo Jr., for sharing some of his own memories of running numbers with me. The song Clearinghouse Blues, which we heard a clip of, is by the great blues singer Clara Smith, the queen of the moaners. For more info on the series and full transcripts, go to gbhnews.org/scratchandwin. Video for Scratch and Win was produced by Marta Franco and Joni Tobin and edited by Marta Franco. The artwork is by Bill Miller and Mami Hawabawo. Our closing song is You Made Me Love You, performed by Massachusetts State Treasurer Bob Crane. Scratch and Win is a production of GBH News and distributed by PRX.
I need some love that's true. Yes, I do. Indeed, I do. You know I do. So give me what I cry for. You know you got the brand of kisses that I die for. You know you made me. You know you made me. You know you made me love you. And all the time you knew it. Thank you. You come in on that.